Sins of a Solar Empire by Ironclad Games is a space-based RTS set in the middle of nowhere. You can take control of one of three factions, one human, one which is also human, and one that I can best describe as mouthless insect beasts with immensely cool voices.
Fighter wing standing by. In the name of the Empire, it's time to move. Planet development finished.
I'll elaborate properly, shall I? As I said, you can play as one of three races in this game: the TEC, or Traders Emergency Coalition, the military arm of the Trader Worlds, your conventional capitalist human civilization, the Advent, who are augmented psychic exiles come back to exact vengeance on the Trader Worlds, who, in a blatant act of racism and unneighbourly conduct, nicked their sandy homeworld and booted them off into uncharted space. Finally, there's the Visari, a nomadic and somewhat less than pleasant species who've happened to run headlong into humanity, resulting in interstellar fisticuffs. Once you've chosen your side, you're given a starting world and a few paltry handouts with which to develop and later expand your empire. In adjacent areas, you may well find colonizable planets or asteroids, invariably guarded by a horde of locals, specifically the small but proud home guard of an impoverished or newly established sovereign power, and they will fight to the last man in defense of their world, which you've invaded in the name of colonial expansion. If this seems a little unpleasant to you, then just tell yourself they're pirates. They're barely established anyway. To be able to do much of anything, you'll need to harvest the appropriate resources, namely metal, crystals and tax money. The first two can be mined from the convenient asteroids loitering in orbit of your planets, or else floating in the middle of debris fields. The latter is beaten out of your subjects. The more planets you have, and the better developed they are, the more you get. If you want to avoid defeat, subjugation and or extinction, you do well to research better technologies and sociological practices with haste. There are two main fields of research, civilian and military, with various subsets built into each. Civilian research deals with ways to improve the infrastructure of your empire, and also certain non-violent technologies. Military deals with improvements to your fighting forces. To research anything, you'll have to build research stations. More are required for the niftier things, and none are cheap. Managing your empire is refreshingly complex, yet rarely is it annoying. Expansion costs time and money, and new colonies don't start out as contributing beneficial worlds, but are in fact unappealing, underdeveloped shanties that actually cost you money from your tax income. Only by throwing yet more resources at these worlds can you turn them into worthwhile additions to your star nation. As you might expect from such a game as this, the ultimate goal of dominance is achieved more through war than the advancement of civilization. As you might not expect, there's almost nothing in terms of an established storyline, save for the backstory of the three races. I'd rather not admit to how long I spent looking for the single-player campaign button. Later checking in with the website informed me that the idea was instead for players to devise their own stories via the sandbox mode. This approach, I'm sorry to say, seems lazy. There was every opportunity to include both the linear campaign mode for all three factions, as is the standard for such games as this, and still keep the sandbox mode, allowing players the freedom to create their own scenarios, as is also the standard for the genre. Consider Command and Conquer, Homeworld, and the similar underrated RTS, Conquest Frontier Wars, which followed a similar theme of fleet-based warfare in space, with three separate factions. All of these games possess both story-driven campaigns and nifty sandbox modes. Leaving out the story makes it harder to care about the sides you're controlling, or even figure out who they are. Anyway, on to the military aspects. Fleets are typically built around capital ships, and you can have a variety of these, each with a particular speciality such as combat, carrying fighter craft, fleet support and others. These are flanked by frigates and cruisers, which also serve various roles: scouting, command, planetary devastation, things like that. Fleet engagements are a pleasure of this game, in the rare instances when you actually get them. Should your force prove to be the stronger, the enemy does have the annoying tendency to turn tail and piss off, sometimes even abandoning their own throne world to the depredations of your forces. Wars are fought and ultimately won by wiping your enemy from the face of all existence, one world at a time. Once you've stripped away a planet's defences and stand unopposed, standard procedure is to have your capital ships and any nearby siege frigates bomb the Christ out of said planet until the entire colony is destroyed, leaving you free to build a new one in its place. Again, if this is a mite too distressing, or you'd rather not play as an organisation that views genocide as standard operational procedure, you can always tell yourself that once the colony is destroyed, you go down and subjugate the survivors, who are safely ensconced in their emergency shelters, playing tiddlywinks and singing sea shanties, whilst you rained environmentally friendly nuclear death upon their homesteads. There's also some folderol about cultural influence. You can have media stations broadcasting propaganda to yours and your enemies' planets, increasing the overall loyalty of yours and inciting sedition and rebellion on theirs. This is a slower and less bloody road to galactic domination, but in practice, odds are all you'd achieve is diminishing the enemy's tax income and increasing their build times. I dare say that given a choice between slow cultural subversion and quick cultural annihilation, the latter would appeal to players the most. There can be some dramatic moments during gameplay, like a pitched battle for control of a choice planet, or having to manically rush your agonizingly slow fleet back through your empire to one of your colonies which is being savaged by pirates, cunningly hired by your enemies, whilst you are off elsewhere seeking out new worlds and civilizations, and shooting them. Odds are, however, that once you've risen high enough, that is to say, smashed your enemies' fleets to dust, positioned enough forces and static defences throughout your colonies to keep them safe, researched and developed to such an extent where you've more tax money and minerals than you'll ever need, and planted your flag atop the enemy's homeworld, that you'll still have a ton of busy work to do. Moving your forces from system to system, putting the remaining enemy's settlements to the torch, and smashing their now useless stations. This is mostly a problem on the smaller scale games, however. Larger maps allow you to go up against a multitude of opposing factions, and this can add an additional degree of challenge. For example, you can find yourself having to defend your territory from a simultaneous attack by 3 sides, and wind up losing and rebuilding the same colony world several times over. These larger scale games do open another option, however, diplomacy, though frankly this feels rather underdeveloped in the game. A slidey percentage bar dictates your relationship with other factions, and unless you're specifically set to be on the same team in the game's setup screen, every other faction will start off hating you, and it's far easier to keep them hating you than it is to have them like you. The only way to improve relations is to complete the randomly distributed and occasionally nonsensical quests they hand to you, and, I think, to bribe them, which I've never deigned do myself. Conversely, blasting their ships to dust, failing, or more specifically ignoring their quests, and wiping their colonies out can have a somewhat adverse effect on your relationships with them. Jeez, how oversensitive can you get? Nevertheless, if you raise your stats high enough, you may be offered a ceasefire, and later a peace treaty, which sounds well and good, except that you'll still be bombarded with inconvenient quests, they'll still run away when danger looms, and whine incessantly for assistance when their worlds come under attack. I don't know if this is a consistent feature, but after joining forces with one faction and defeating another during a game, my allies then turned around and betrayed me. Curiously, this happened after the victory screen had showed up. I also don't know if this is related, but during this alliance, they made it a point to station no less than 10 planet-killing frigates near a world I'd nicked from them during a period of initial hostilities following first contact. Whether this was by accident or design, it provided a nice foreshadowing of the later treachery. Overall, allies are of questionable value, but considering the game is about 3 mortal enemies and the ultimate dominance of your faction, that may be just the game being consistent. What's nice is that you never find yourself fighting, or indeed playing as, the entire empire, but instead assorted factions such as syndicates, cults, clans, corporations, or whatnot. This serves to justify the small scale of the battles between 3 seemingly huge nations, and, if you're of a mind to fashion your own story, it adds to the replayability value. It also gives good cause for factions of the same race to fight against each other.
We of the Tulip Corporation are greatly offended by your ships dumping bodies in the gardens of our central offices from orbit. Just last week one fell on the head of my secretary, and she suffered a most beastly headache as a result. I shall give you but one warning. Desist, or face the wrath of our underpaid, badly equipped mercenary flotilla.
Yes. I think you've got the wrong number, sir. This is the New Sydney Bookbinding Service.
Ah, your impudence has grown intolerable. Vendetta upon your empire.
Simmons, put the Armada on standby, just in case. As you command, Scribe Admiral. In the weeks that followed, the forces of the New Sydney Bookbinding Service smashed the puny Tulip Corporation into mulch. Anyway, there are mods, multiplayer features, and expansions for the game, but I've played none of them. On its own single-player merits, however, I would describe it as being fairly good. Easy to learn, difficult to master, and, at times, infuriatingly difficult to put down. The lack of a story is a major mark against Sins of a Solar Empire in my opinion, but nevertheless, it's pretty and stuff blows up, which to me makes it well worth the £5 that I shelled out for it.